This episode is brought to you by my very first book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. With over 1,000 research citations, it is the most comprehensive resource on fertility awareness and the menstrual cycle to date. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/vitalsign for a free sample of the first chapter. That's fertilityfriday.com/vitalsign. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 241. Welcome to the 241st episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. In today's episode, I will be spending some time taking you behind the scenes so that you can get a peek into a little window into what it was like to write my first book, The Fifth Vital Sign: Master Your Cycles and Optimize Your Fertility. And just to give you a sense of, basically what it took to bring this book into real life. And it's really interesting to be in a project where you're working on something for so long, and then when it's finally released, it almost seems like it's not real, like, oh my goodness, because of how much went into it. And so I'm recording this episode actually the day after the book has gone live, and a couple of really neat and exciting things have happened since then. And so once the book was released over the weekend, the book has actually shot up to the #1 bestseller in a couple of different categories, which is super exciting. And so The Fifth Vital Sign was listed as the #1 bestseller in the fertility category and also in the obstetrics and gynecology category, and that's in the US store. And I think also one of those categories in the Canadian store. So that's really, really exciting. And of course, that wouldn't have been possible without the Fertility Friday community. So I just want to thank all of you for supporting the show and supporting the book and really helping to spread the word about it, and also for believing in the message. And really, that's the whole point. From the first day that I started the podcast up until right now that I'm holding the copy of The Fifth Vital Sign in my hands, the goal has always been the same, and it's to educate women about our fifth vital sign, to really fill that gap between what we are, what our education system is leaving out of our education, which is basically everything. Our education system doesn't really equip us or prepare us, and certainly doesn't educate us about our bodies and our fertility. And so really my intention here is to continue to bridge that gap. As women, we really deserve to have access to the latest information so that we can really make informed decisions about our health, about our fertility, and that so we can really understand how our cycles work. And really, that is the goal. The goal is to kind of shatter the myth that the menstrual cycle is only about reproduction, that we only need to have healthy cycles when it's time to have babies, and then outside of that window of time, when we're trying to grow our families, that we don't even need to have a period, or we shouldn't really be concerned if our cycles are a little bit messy. So let me start by just jumping into what the process of researching and writing the book was like. I've said this before, but really, so when I embarked on this book writing process, I really believed that it would be an easy, quick process. I tend to be very optimistic, and I kind of just jump into things without always fully thinking them through. And I really thought, yeah, this is going to be relatively easy. I'm just going to sit down. I'm just going to write this book. And I really thought that it would take me about 6 months. Like I thought it would be published and ready to go within, maybe a couple more months than that. Like I kind of thought, okay, maybe after I write it and then I'll, have to do some editing and stuff, and it might take me a year. So I completely believed that. And as I started writing, I realized, for me, what was the most important thing as I wrote this book was I really wanted to make it a solid resource. So there's a lot of things that I know and a lot of things that I've acquired through my training, through working with women over the years, but I didn't want to make it into just an opinion piece. I really wanted to research all of the different topics that I was talking about so I could kind of flesh out the book, make it more meaty, and really include a lot of relevant and important information. So as I embarked on that journey, it really just took on a life of its own. And I was really able to delve into the research and, just basically on all of the important topics that I wanted to cover. And the combination of doing extensive research and writing really added on probably, between 6 months to, I don't know about a full year, but it certainly added on either 6 months or a full year onto the writing process over and above what I thought it would take me to do that. And so I was definitely humbled by the process, but I really enjoyed the process. I definitely enjoyed delving into the research and seeing what it had to say. And there were a lot of really interesting benefits of taking the time to do that. I think one of the most important benefits of really taking the time to research and look at what the current scientific literature is saying, there's a couple things that come out of that. One is that it's really reassuring to see how much research there actually is. And it's really reassuring to see how much evidence there is to support a lot of the different concepts that I always talk about on the show. So to support the notion that the menstrual cycle is important for health and that the menstrual cycle changes when health is out of alignment. It's also reassuring to know that there's a lot of evidence to back up how specific nutrients, dietary and lifestyle practices can significantly impact the health of our cycles and our overall health in general. It's really just empowering to see the actual research so that you can kind of get that sense of like, wow, I'm not powerless in this. I can actually do a lot to improve my cycles. And having a bit of knowledge in addition to working with a practitioner is golden in that case, because, not only can you seek the professional support of somebody who hopefully knows more than you, but you can also ask for specific types of testing or ask them to focus on specific things, because now you're an educated patient who is really actively advocating for yourself. So there's a lot of implications just with that. One of the other interesting observations that I made after going through so much research is that research is not infallible. And there's a current trend for us to defer to the science and assume that the science is infallible, meaning that if a research paper says something, we read the abstract or even look at the whole thing and make decisions based on this assumption that, the research is completely infallible. One of the things that I did discover as I was researching for this book is that researchers are people, and people, we all have our own biases. And so there's situations where researchers can look at specific data and draw specific conclusions. And, a different researcher or a different person could look at the same data and draw a different conclusion. And so one of the examples in my book of this very specifically is about how birth control affects fertility. And so, what the research shows us when you look at the data is that women who take hormonal birth control experience a temporary delay in the return of their normal fertility once they come off of it. So, some individuals in the health field have called this post-birth control syndrome, but we can call it whatever we want. But what the research shows us is there is a well-established temporary delay in the return of a woman's normal fertility. And so there's a couple ways that this shows up. So, one of the studies that I looked at was measuring the menstrual cycle parameters of women immediately coming off of birth control. And so they had a group of women that had never been on birth control, and then they had a group of women that had taken birth control. And they actually measured the menstrual cycle parameters. So they were looking at how long is the follicular phase, so when is ovulation happening in the cycle, how long is the luteal phase, so, how many days between ovulation and their next period, and basically breaking the cycle down so that we get a sense of like, okay, so is there an effect post, birth control on the actual cycle? And so a study like that is interesting because it's actually giving us information about what the cycle would look like. And that helps us to understand what we can expect when we come off of birth control. So if you've been on birth control for a while, of course, a lot of women are you want to know, when does my period come back? How long is it going to take before my cycles are normal again? And so in that particular study, what was really interesting was that on average, it took about 9 to 12 cycles before the women who had come off hormonal birth control, before their cycles looked about the same as the women who never took birth control. So a couple of things were quite typical coming off of birth control. So one was that at first, the cycles tend to be longer, meaning that either it takes a bit of time for the first period to come back or not. Some women get their periods back quickly. But when you look at the average cycle length, on average, ovulation is a bit delayed. So the first couple cycles off birth control tend to be longer because it takes longer for ovulation to happen in the cycle. Another typical aspect of coming off birth control is that the luteal phase is often shorter. So, whereas in a healthy cycle, you would expect to ovulate and then have your period about 12 to 14 days later, it's quite typical in those first several cycles off the pill for the luteal phase length to be shorter. And so instead of the normal 12 to 14 days, we might be looking at 7, 8, 9 days. And, it took several cycles before, on average, that evened out. And so there's other factors that we could look at as well. We could look at cervical mucus production. So it's not uncommon for women to have abnormal cervical mucus production, post-pill. And this can show up in a number of ways. So, in a healthy cycle, when hormonal birth control isn't at play, we would expect, anywhere from 2 to 7 days of cervical mucus as you approach ovulation. But for some women come off birth control, and even if they're ovulating, they're not producing any mucus. So they're basically having cycles that are dry, they're checking for mucus, and they're not seeing any. So I'll note that it is possible to get pregnant in any cycle that you ovulate. But of course, given the essential role of cervical mucus in supporting fertility, keeping sperm alive, there's a lot of really fantastic qualities of mucus. If you are trying to conceive, that is part of the reason that you may experience like a subfertile. You may be in a subfertile state, because if you're not producing any mucus, then conception would therefore very possibly be harder. That makes a lot of sense. So some women might not see any mucus for the first few cycles, or some women may see very little. And, this is not something that's typically permanent, so I think that's helpful to know. It typically improves as the hormones kind of come out your system, as your cycles improve, as your, regular estrogen and progesterone levels reestablish themselves, as your cervical crypts kind of recover. And so I think that's helpful as well. And then also, if you conceive, after you have your baby, pregnancy has been known to rejuvenate the cervical crypt. So I've worked with women who didn't have very much mucus post-pill, but after pregnancy actually saw an increase. But, not all women experience limited mucus post-pill. Some women experience a lot of mucus. So some women experience a lot of discharge, my favorite word. But, it really depends on what that particular woman is experiencing. But this is all just to say that, what the research tells us is that there is a specific period of time post-pill where your body needs to normalize and where you can expect your menstrual cycle parameters to be outside of the normal range. And what the research tells us is that is anywhere from 9 to 12 menstrual cycles. And menstrual cycles is not the same as months. So when I'm saying 9 to 12 cycles, for some women, that's going to be, 12 to 18 months before their cycles fully normalize and kind of all parameters are falling into the normal range. Okay, so one way to look at it is like, what do the cycles look like? But the other way to look at it is like, how long does it take you to get pregnant? And so there's a lot of research, the time to pregnancy studies, where they're actually looking at how long it takes women to get pregnant post-birth control. And what's interesting is that, women taking the pill, so, your typical combined contraceptive options, so contraceptives that contain a combination of synthetic estrogens and progestins. So that would be like the pill, the patch, and the ring, typically. So women who were taking those preparations typically took about twice as long to get pregnant. So, in one of the studies that I was looking at, actually a couple of the different studies showed similar results. But women who weren't on any type of hormonal birth control would typically conceive in an average of 4 months, which is quite typical. So your average healthy couple has about a 25% chance of conceiving in any given cycle. And so therefore, that makes sense. It'd take an average of about 4 cycles. But for women who are coming off birth control, it took an average of 8 cycles. And that's an average. So that means some women conceived earlier than that and some women conceived later than that. But on average, it took them twice as long. So women coming off birth control pills. The most significant delay in the return of fertility was seen in users of injectable contraceptives like the Depo shot, where, the average time to pregnancy was about 18 months. This is an example of how, depending on the researcher and the researcher's own kind of perspective on the world, is going to affect how they're going to interpret the data. So the data itself is the same, but when you look at the conclusion that the researchers draw, in a lot of these time to pregnancy studies, the conclusion that they draw is that, the pill is a reversible contraceptive method. Not, normal fertility returns within whatever 6-12 month period, and therefore it's completely fine. And so the researchers focus on the fact that it is reversible this effect is temporary and eventually it returns to normal. So it's completely not a big deal. Whereas I look at that, and I, as a woman who has children and as a woman who works with other women who want to have children, I look at the same information and interpret it completely differently. So I think it's a huge deal. And I think it's really important that women know about it. I feel like that's what it is. So if we don't know about something, we can't plan for it. If we don't know that the pill can have a detrimental impact on our fertility, even if it's temporarily, then we can't plan for it. We can't actually do anything about it. And so there's so many women out there who have been really just trying to do everything perfectly throughout their whole lives. So we learned from a young age, most of us, that, incorrectly, that we could get pregnant on every day of our cycles, which leads a lot of women to be super scared of getting pregnant, of course, under any circumstances. So we do the responsible thing, go on the pill, and then that box is checked, right? Like that's sorted. And then for a lot of women, that box is checked and continues to be checked for a long time, whether that's 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years. In the meantime, we're trying to get everything together. We're trying to get our careers together, our relationships together, our life situation in a stable enough way for us to kind of, plan for the future so that eventually, for many of us, we can start a family. We want to have some stability before we bring kids into the world for the most part. And so, for a lot of women, finally, the boxes are checked. I'm in the relationship I want to be. I'm in the career I want to be. Everything is looking pretty good. And now, and I want to uncheck the birth control box and I want to get pregnant right away. And no matter how many women I talk to, no matter, for you yourself, you may have gone through this, or you may have had a friend who's like, oh, I'm going off the pill. I don't expect to get pregnant like right away. If it doesn't happen for like a month or two, it's totally fine. The thing about it is that when you switch from avoiding to trying to conceive, especially given that we're taught that you can get pregnant on every single day of your cycle and you've spent probably half of your life avoiding it, you really assume that you're going to get pregnant. Like no matter what you say to yourself, you really feel like it's going to happen immediately. And so if you don't know that hormonal birth control is associated with this temporary delay in the return of normal fertility, then the first month, it's okay. But by the second month, you're already stressing. By the third month, a lot of women are really, really stressed out by the fact that they're not pregnant yet. And by the 8th or 9th or 10th month, you may already be in the fertility clinic about to, embark on a journey involving a lot of different expensive, injections and hormones and chemicals and all of that, all in a sense when your body is still in that transition phase. And so this is like a long explanation of my experience of just going through all the research. But one of the things I think is really important is even with scientific research, the researchers themselves have their own opinions, biases. They're looking at the information through their own lens. And for me, as a woman who works with women in this field of fertility, I'm looking at that same data and saying, no, this temporary delay in the return of normal fertility is a problem. Like it is an actual issue for women because we're not told about it. Therefore, we can't plan for it. So if you tell women about it and we know about it, then what that means is when we're ready to start our families, if you're taking hormonal birth control, you can just come off of it like before you're ready to try. So you come off of it when you're still actively avoiding so that you can give your body time. And of course, that means that you have to find an alternative way to prevent pregnancy because even though there's this temporary delay in the normal return of fertility, if you're ovulating, there's always a possibility of conception. And so there's this interesting kind of parallel happening where I really believe that if, as women, we knew about this, if doctors were telling us about this, that we would then have the opportunity to come off the hormones a lot sooner and then give our body the time it needs. And all of this before you're actively trying to conceive. Because, of course, the thought is like if you're coming off the pill, you're going to get pregnant right away. But we're not really encouraged to take that extra time. And so, in the process of writing this book and just over the past, 2 decades, I've had so many conversations with women who have this kind of internal sense. It's like your internal guidance system that says, okay, I've been on this thing for a while. I'm getting married in the fall, or my partner and I are thinking about starting family. And, I have this hunch that maybe I should come off these hormones sooner to give my body a break. And a number of women, they don't just have the thought. The thought is strong enough that they book an appointment with their practitioner and they actually go in and talk to their practitioner about it. And what typically happens for a lot of women is that their practitioners are telling them like, well, no, you don't need to do that. There's no reason. Fertility comes back right away. This is a reversible, method. The research shows that there's no permanent effect on fertility, so you're fine. And again, like that slight interpretation of the data that this temporary delay is not a big deal and that the fertility returns back to normal, that slight interpretation of that little piece of data then can send women into a tailspin, because by the time their bodies are naturally recovering and getting back to normal, hormone levels are normal, cycles are starting to regulate, they have already been trying to conceive actively in many cases for 8 months, 12 months. And so right around the time that their bodies are potentially starting to kind of get back in the swing of things, they're already kind of halfway through fertility treatment. So that's just something I wanted to share, because that was one of my kind of big takeaways as going through all the research. Like, on the one hand, I was really reassured that there was so much, because I feel like in this day and age, it's really important for us to be able to rely on the data to really see what it shows us so that we can make informed decisions based on that actual evidence. But on the other hand, we can't make this blind assumption that we can just like look at the researchers' conclusions and let that be our conclusions. And so in examining the research, a big part of my process was actually reading the whole paper, going through, not just reading the abstract, getting the full text, reading through it, highlighting, making notes, and really getting what the research is showing, and then also what the conclusions are, and kind of do they match? And what do I think about them? How do I interpret the data, right? And so that's just something that is really important, because although, the book is really like science heavy, and that's how I am. I really thrive, and I really love, and I'm really interested in the research. I really enjoy kind of diving into it. It's really interesting. And I think maybe the most interesting part of it is that like it hasn't come into your doctor's office. So there's a lot of this research, and it always blows my mind. It's just like, well, then why is this not part of common medical practice if there's so much research behind it? But so that's part of the reason that I find it fascinating. But at the same time, we have to really be able to look at it critically and, not just defer to the conclusions of the researchers, to be able to look at the data ourselves, or, a trusted source of someone who helps you to interpret that data. But whatever the case is, to really think critically about the information that you see. As I was writing, I found myself experiencing a lot of different emotions along the way. I mean, one, I really had to surrender to the process, because I went in with a lot of expectations of how long things would take and what it would be like, and what this phase of the writing process would be like, and what that phase of the writing process would be like. And ultimately, as a first-time author, I really just had to surrender to the process and start to just allow it to be what it needed to be. And so I had to give away, I had to completely let go of a number of different deadlines I had made for myself. And I think that I had made myself at least 3 or 4 deadlines of, okay, the book's going to be done on this day, and the book's going to be done on this day. And, there were several times where that just didn't happen. And the deadline had to be pushed back. And in retrospect, I don't even know if the deadline strategy was a good one. I think it is important to set goals and to have expectations for yourself. But in my case, given that I was going for like quality, not only deadline, I just had to kind of ride the wave. And so there were some days where I would literally open up, 10 different research studies on one topic and read through them all, highlight them, make notes, all the different points, and write one paragraph. And that was it for that day. And that one paragraph would take me 2 hours or 4 hours or something like that. And it sounds crazy, but that's actually the truth. And then there were other days when I would sit down and, write a ton, and a lot would come. So there was a lot of different emotions. There were the emotions around the process itself, how long it took, my expectations around it. But then there were emotions about the actual material. And, a big part of my book was to share women's stories. And so over the last couple of years, I've done a number of Real Women Stories podcast episodes where I was interviewing members of the Fertility Friday community. And some of those stories appear in the book. And, so part of that, when I talk about the emotions that I was feeling, it's just a very interesting experience to be researching on a very specific topic and also speaking to a woman who is experiencing, like, for example, if I'm researching a specific condition, hypothalamic amenorrhea, HA is a good example of that. So, I'm researching this condition and, getting the words on the page and really illustrating what the research has to say while simultaneously speaking to women who are experiencing or have experienced HA and are sharing their experiences about it. So there was a lot of emotions that I felt. And for me, I've been in this field for so long that the anger muscle, I think, is tired. I definitely feel a lot of anger when I hear women suffering and when I hear about women who have negative experiences with their practitioners, women who are basically being told a lot of information that isn't, 100% factual. So I've said it a number of times in this episode, like women who are told that there's nothing they can do, women who are told that what they're experiencing is normal when it's not. And so I definitely, that sparks a lot of different feelings in me, from frustration to anger. But over the years, I've really found ways to channel it. And so this book was, again, a challenge for me to channel a lot of those emotions and energy and frustration, anger, disappointment about the kind of the system and the general order of things into something more productive. So I always aim to channel my feelings of frustration and all of that into something productive. And so, given how, mammoth the book is, I guess I have a lot of frustration. But that was something that surprised me along the way because, these topics weren't new to me, but I suppose going in as much depth as I did with the research, I think it was almost like a feeling of betrayal. Like, okay, people talk about these things. We know about these things. I've had a number of guests on the show to, illustrate how these topics are affecting women. And on top of it, there's hundreds of thousands of research papers on these various topics that show in black and white how women are affected, and yet still the medical system remains the same. So there was certainly a bit of, I guess betrayal would be the word, that I had to kind of just process along the way. So I was simultaneously relieved that there was so much evidence, and then also just disheartened. And I'm left with that unanswerable question of how long is it going to take before things change? So if anyone has the answer, I want to hear it. Maybe none of us have the answer, but there's certainly that question that is left outstanding. So at the end of this project, took so long to get all the words on the page, spent so much time writing, editing, researching, editing again, all of that, to the point that, the book itself is finally done. And I'm left with that question of how much longer is it going to take before the system is different, before women are just made aware of their bodies and how it works, before the medical professionals start to take seriously the link between our cycles and our health and stop trying to shove everything under the rug with birth control pills. And, what's it going to take for our healthcare system in general to recognize that drugs aren't the answer to everything? Sometimes what we need as women is some support in developing proper dietary lifestyle habits so that we can see the improvements that we want. Sometimes the answer isn't just inherently in some sort of medication. And there's obviously a shift towards a more kind of functional medicine approach to things, looking at the root cause, trying to find out what's wrong, recognizing that we have a lot of power to make those changes. But that's, I suppose, where I'm at after finishing writing the book. It's like the process of me writing this book added even more fuel to my fire because before I had a really deep understanding of how this affects women, but now I have both sides. I have the experience, woman to woman for all of these years, and the research to back it up. And the fact that it wasn't hard for me to find it was, I think, just the most striking thing about the process. Like, it wasn't really, I thought it would be a lot harder to find information. I thought that it would be few and far between and I would really have to kind of dig, but it wasn't like that. There were certain topics that were easier to find information than others. So I'll say that there were certain topics that were harder to find current research. And again, that comes down to the question of what are the researchers studying? What current research topics are being funded. What are the trends in that particular area right now? And so I won't get into all the complexities of that in today's episode, but there's definitely trends. And really, it comes down to what's being studied and also what's being published and where, what types of information are we allowed to have access to? Like what types of studies what types of studies are funded, and what types of studies that are actually completed and done will even be accepted into major publications, and why. And so, again, this just comes down to the fact that science is not infallible. There's a lot of questions there. It provides us with a ton of information, but it even goes so deep as to say what research is funded, what research is published, and what topics are allowed. And I've heard different researchers say things like, well, I had to focus a little bit on this topic so that it would get approved, or I submitted this publication to 5 or 6 different major journals and it wasn't accepted because it was on this topic. And a lot of topics related to the menstrual cycle, female hormones. I mean, you just have to remember who controls the flow of information. So yes, this process has been very, very interesting, very eye-opening. And like I said, it just added more fuel to my fire. It really showed me how important it is for women to have access to this information. We need to move past the stage where all of the scientific literature was kind of held behind an ivory tower and no one had access to it. And really, we just had to kind of go to our doctors and trust that they knew everything and just put our lives into their hands and let them make all the decisions for us. So we need to move away from that model and start to take control of our own health and our own fertility. Because as I always say, no one cares more about your fertility and your health than you do. No one is going to take the time that you would to research and find the answers to your questions and your specific issues. And with that in mind, when you're choosing practitioners to work with you, you really want to find practitioners who specialize in the specific issue that you are dealing with, and also who care, who really genuinely care about their patients and have the same kind of paradigm that you do. So if you're wanting to look at things in a natural way and you're wanting to identify the underlying factors and all of that, then finding a practitioner who's the same way, that you don't have to convince to do that, is very, very helpful. And so that's really what this is about. And those are my personal conclusions after writing the book, just how important that is and how different the world can be when we as women know what's going on in our bodies. And it's interesting because fertility awareness then becomes the gateway drug to all of this. It really is the kind of the first thing that allows us to connect with our cycles and to start to actually see this physical evidence that, wow, my cycles do respond to my health. And if I'm experiencing different health challenges, I can see that on my chart. And that really puts you in the driver's seat, empowers you. So it all kind of ties together because I'm always looking at the menstrual cycle chart and relating everything back to how your cycles are influenced by your health. It really guides everything that I do, and it also guides the way that I look at things. And so I, as someone who has that perspective, it's interesting how that informs the way that I interpret the research and how I present it. Not that I'm still presenting the facts, just in the same way that when you read a research paper, the researcher is presenting the facts. But in the discussion piece, when the researcher describes what it means, their perspective is what guides how they're going to interpret that information. And we need more women in this field interpreting that data and specifically interpreting it in a way that is relevant to us and how we live our lives. And to be honest with you, I feel like that piece of it is different. The how we live our lives piece and why a certain thing might not be relevant to one researcher, but might actually be relevant to millions of women. I think it's time for us to start interpreting that data for ourselves and also to have access to as much information as we can so that we can really take control of our fertility and our health. And I feel like that's a safer bet than waiting for the whole world to change and waiting for the entire practice of medicine to change. I feel like it's a safer bet for us to kind of start owning this space and taking control of our health. I feel like it's a safer bet for us to do that ourselves Of course, deferring to health professionals as needed. So I'm not saying like give up on health professionals, because health professionals are highly trained professionals in their different fields. So just to clarify, we still need doctors, we still need health practitioners, but we also need to have access to very specific information. We need to have that free access to as much information as possible so that we can really start to advocate for ourselves intelligently, definitively, and consistently so that we can get the care that we need. And so I want to thank you for spending some time with me today. This has been just an incredible week. All I can say is that this process has been very time-consuming, all-consuming, really. And I am tired. I'm going to have to read my chapter 12 and 13 again. Chapter 12 is Nutrition for Healthy Cycles, and chapter 13 is Lifestyle Choices for Healthy Cycles. If you've ever had one of those moments in time where you were under a lot of stress and had a lot of deadlines looming and doing a lot of work, I'm a human being as well. So I certainly, a few too many late nights with this book project. I certainly had a couple days where I wasn't cooking as I usually cook every night. And so, for me at this time, this stage, now that the book is here, and now that I can breathe and relax, because that stage of writing and editing and formatting and all of that is over, for me, it's time for me to kind of take a step back, take a few deep breaths, and really get back into the practices that allowed me to get here in the first place. I've actually had a few friends ask me, have you celebrated yet? Have you taken any time? And today, as of today, I have not. I have not actually had an opportunity to just take it all in, sit down, relax, and really celebrate. So that is what's on the agenda, in the next couple of days and weeks, and really just to take it all in. So with that said, I will bring this episode to a close. I really wanted to take some time and share a little bit about what the process was like and some of my takeaways, and I suppose just giving you a window into my mind as it came to this process and how it affected me, kind of looking through and interpreting all that research and compiling this book, and also now why it's so necessary for me to take some time just to relax and rejuvenate and restore, because it certainly takes a lot out of you when you have a big project like this. So I just want to thank all of you for being part of the Fertility Friday community, for being so incredibly supportive. And I really appreciate the response to the book has been incredible. It's been very encouraging. And again, I what I really feel is, as women, we just immediately resonate with that message that, wait a minute, our menstrual cycles are important. I feel like it really kind of connects with the intuitive sense that we always had, or that was already there. And so I hope that this book will be for you what was my initial intention with writing it, which is in a way, for me, if I had this resource available to me when I was, 18, 19, and first starting to discover fertility awareness and the connection between my cycles and my health, it wouldn't have taken me so long to figure it out. I wouldn't have had to struggle with period pain for almost a decade of my life. I could have figured that out sooner. I wouldn't have had to go through as many struggles and trials and tribulations in order to get to the place that I feel really confident advocating for myself and for what I need. And so that's really what this is about. So whether you're discovering this information in your early 20s, your mid 30s, or your early 40s, really this is a resource that I really wish that I had, and something that you'll be able to refer to again and again. So for more information, and also to get the first chapter, if you'd like to get the sample first chapter of the book, you can head over to thefifthvitalsignbook.com, all spelled out. So FIFTH, thefifthvitalsignbook.com. And so you can get the first chapter of the book there. So a little sample, a little peek. And also the book is available on Amazon in both ebook and paperback formats. And yes, I am working on the audio. I have not yet finished the audio book, but it's definitely coming together. So that should be out within the next couple of weeks or so. So I'll keep you posted. And so with that said, thank you so much for listening and for hanging out with me today. Have an awesome week. And as always, be well and happy charting.